Morning, friends, and thank you so much for tuning back in with us as we get to I believe this is lesson 5 of our series on stewardship. And as we've talked about so far, we've looked at the importance of this study. We've also looked at our idea of being a fiduciary or power attorney for God. And our last couple of classes, we've tackled budgeting and how we kind of can put some of those principles into practice as we get together. Joining me as always is my esteemed colleague, Mr. Ray. How's everything in Somerset this morning?
It's beautiful this morning. I'm glad to be here. Very blessed.
So we got birds singing in the background. It's a good day.
Shangri-La over here, God's country.
That's right. Good country. Good country.
Land of milk and honey.
So you have big plans for the 3-day weekend? You guys going to go all the way to living room?
I don't know. Andy told me this quarantine was over. I feel cut loose and free.
I don't think they've opened the lake down there though, right?
I don't know. I don't keep up very well.
I'd be surprised if there weren't pitchforks in Somerset over that. But as we get in here this morning, again, kind of setting the stage. Budgeting is where we kind of got into this idea of looking at these categories last few weeks. Michael, catch us up to where we're at from a budgeting standpoint and where we're going to go this morning.
Sure. Well, I'm going to go back, Mike, to a presentation that we began in our last lesson, just on this concept of Christian budgeting. And, we kind of started just with the concept of, is budgeting something that God cares about? And I might go even back a step from that. So is our finances and our assets something God cares about? Well, I hope that we've established and convinced everyone that is an affirmative, that God cares very much about how we treat His possessions. They're His, we're stewards of them, and there is just ample evidence in Scripture, both in the Old and New Testament, that how we handle our possessions is an index of our heart. And so this budgeting is a Christian concept. God tells us to know the conditions of our flocks. He tells us that it's expected that if we want to build a tower, we sit down and count the cost. And again, I know we understand that count the cost idea or parable has some heavenly meaning, but the earthly story kind of is meaningful there too. That Jesus understood that knowing the condition of our possessions was important. And if we are truly stewards, if this is God's stuff, as we've said before, every spending decision becomes a spiritual decision. And so how we handle these dollars is critically important. So I'm going to go briefly through the things we talked about in the last class as we lead into kind of what we're talking about today. So, the first thing we mentioned is every budget is based on a certain income, right? And this particular budget that we are sharing here, this generic stewardship budget, is based on an income of $50,000. It's a household income, and that is gross. And we touched on those things in the last class. That's before any taxes or any benefits come out of that paycheck. What's the gross number? It's $50,000, and that is a state median. So by definition, half of the potential audience of this class would be below that number, and half would be above. But it's whether your individual number is above or below that, the principles certainly still apply. But every budget has to start with something coming in, and so that's what this particular budget is based on. And then below that, you see different categories, different buckets of expenses or of funds going out. And we talked about what we believe is the first one to consider, and that is our giving. And and we talked at some length about the distinction between giving to the local congregation and giving to other, listed here as charitable, but we would call those other kingdom purposes. And the importance of that, and the part of our income that should be devoted to that. And so that's where we left at the last class. So if we are truly giving God the first fruits, then giving is the first line item that gets considered in our budget. And so that we think that's a godly principle. This Mike, in this lesson, we want to talk about another facet of where our money goes, another bucket, so to speak, And after giving, we're now going to talk about saving. And I'll let you take the reins there and kind of talk about in this specific budget, kind of the different buckets that can take place.
Right. So many of the talking heads, if you read Dave Ramsey or Susie Orman or anybody else that's on the radio that's far more popular than Michael and I, you often hear
For
this
now.
for now, noted. You often hear this phrase that you've got to pay yourself first. Pay yourself first. Well, obviously, that's not a scriptural principle. The scriptural principle is we pay kingdom goals first, and that's why we started with giving. But a close second behind that is that we've also got to prepare ourselves, in this idea of saving. So we need to put that aside so that, for both an emergency standpoint and for planning for the future. And we're going to spend our time this morning talking about what that means in planning for the future. And we're going to look at some principles in scripture where that's absolutely, what had happened. But those savings take on different earmarks. So savings, we're going to talk about it as a category, but also, within savings is not only the, emergency savings account like you would have at the bank. Most people have a checking and a savings account, but also the need for life insurance, how that is truly a savings mechanism, how investments, are a savings mechanism around that too. And then retirement accounts, money that we're putting away for retirement. And we're going to spend some time this morning talking also about, what retirement actually means for a Christian and how we should look at and approach and fund that goal as truly a kingdom goal. And I'm persuaded more than ever that really when we plan our retirement correctly as a kingdom goal, and what we're talking about retiring from is retiring from, spending 40 hours at corporation XYZ, that now we've saved and we've planned and we've budgeted enough that we can spend 40 hours working in the kingdom every week, and some things that we can do to benefit there. So we'll talk about that. I don't want to get too far ahead of us there, but this idea of savings is pretty phenomenal when you look at where people end up. So the average or median, again, we're using median numbers, so I think that's important. So median is half below, half above. You just line up all the numbers, and we're taking the one directly in the middle. The median household savings is $7,000 in the U.S. So, that's what the average median household has is $7,000.
And it should be noted, Mike, that would be a combination of all these different types of savings buckets, right? Whether we're talking about emergency fund, retirement, other investments, that's an aggregate number. That's a little scary.
Yeah, I mean, so we're talking, $7,000 all in, and I would argue if you really deep dive into those numbers, 99% of that money is in the 401k account. That's typically, your largest asset because it's almost like taxes. It's forced out of your check. It's going in, and you typically have some type of employer match or employer contribution or employer profit sharing on top of that. So we're talking the majority of people, that's all they've got. Okay. So, or the median of people, half of all people, that's where they at. So, if that's all you got and an emergency happens, what do you do? And I think we sometimes use the idea of emergency, like an emergency is a completely unplanned event. Well, if you've got 60,000 mile tires on your car and you've driven them 80,000 miles, is it an emergency if you blow out a tire? Is it? If you got an HVAC unit that's supposed to last 15 years and you've had it for 22, is it an emergency if it blows out? I mean, I think we take these things and say, oh, well, what happens if this or that? Like, things in life have a useful life expectancy. So therefore, I can realistically plan and say, hey, my tires are going to wear out after 60,000 miles or 40,000 miles or whatever the tread wear is. So I should be prepared to replace them when they get there. My furnace is going to wear out in X number of years. So I have to be prepared to replace it when we hit X number of years. So, emergency is, is kind of an interesting way to look at it. But we should just plan that. Look, if we can plan for most emergencies that cripple families, but if you're living paycheck to paycheck and every dollar you've got's going out, you don't have money for tires. You don't have money for HVAC. You may not have money for an oil change, but we should have that, kind of planned and baked into the budget so that these things aren't crippling to a family. But here's the other thing, and especially in times like this, if we don't have an emergency fund, if we don't have a savings fund, there are a lot of families that, may be facing one or both of them laid off right now. And, while the governor and, all the boys in Washington will tell you that, hey, there's all these unemployment benefits, talk to somebody that's trying to do that. It's taken a while to get there. Some people it's, a month or 6 weeks behind before that first unemployment check comes in. And it's great that it finally came in, but you got bills to do between there, right? And so if you don't have something set up to fall back on as a cushion, to be able to pay some bills while you're working things out, and even in this pandemic, or, if, God forbid your company shuts down, your company could file bankruptcy. You could be the best employee in the world at company XYZ, but based on, terrible corporate management, your company files bankruptcy and you're looking for a job. Well, what are you going to do in the meantime? So that's all part of what we're talking about, in this idea of savings. Michael, what's some of your thoughts, just from a broad view when we look at savings?
Well, I love your concept there, Mike, that of what we should define as an emergency. I think perhaps better defined as I think this through, that mentally, that's really a replacement fund, right? I mean, because it's not, it is not house burned down money. It is replace the dishwasher money. And we know that there is planned obsolescence and all that stuff, right? That as you know, there are things that are going to over time have to be replaced. And if that catches us completely off guard, it starts the cycle of debt that many people find themselves caught into. And so if there is not a replacement kind of fund, and I like replacement fund, I think, better than emergency fund for just the reasons you articulated. If there's not a replacement fund, then we're kind of limited on what our options are when those events happen. And no question that if you see somebody else in one of those difficult circumstances, we go back to the giving lesson. We should have something there that we can share. But that may be even another reason that we have those replacement funds, so we can help someone else in those times. I would, we spoke last lesson. One of the practical things that we noted was we should have a kingdom purposes fund. Well, in a lot of ways, that's a savings fund before it's a giving fund. It kind of blurs the lines. And so we need to be setting aside our kingdom purposes, saving that money up, not for ourselves, but so we can help somebody else who may have a true emergency that we can help. So I think, we're not limiting ourselves to these buckets for sure. And I think it's also important that we understand that there is planned needs that we need to be thinking about. And I think it's, maybe jumping into the practical here, but I think it's perfectly reasonable to have those different buckets, even mentally or maybe even physically, set aside. As you know, the checking and savings account is pretty cheap. And right. So should there be a car replacement bucket? It's money that's sitting out there for that purpose, and it's earmarked for that, and it's set aside. And there is a roof replacement bucket. There's nothing wrong with those being not only mentally but physically segregated funds.
And when we look at that, there's, from a financial planning standpoint, what we look at is, essentially 3 different buckets within any of our, accounts, right? There is short-term bucket, right? This is stuff that we need to have readily available. And that's your checking and savings account. That's money that's on demand. You can go touch today.
Yeah, and to your point, I think in our example here, this would be the first line item.
Yeah.
It's the savings account. That is the short term. Something breaks today. The dishwasher breaks today. That's the replacement fund for that device. Sorry.
Right. And it's funny, we talk about going and getting our hands on it, but, in today's financial world, you can get into the app and move the money to your checking account, or you can pay directly out of your savings account from the app. So those types of things are what we're talking about here. Then there is medium-term goals. So medium-term goals, we're looking at somewhere in the 3 to 5 year space. So in those medium-term goals, you don't have to have that money liquid and available, because down the road is when you need that. So you've got the time to earn interest on that. So, if you think about the parable of the talents that we talked about, that he said, hey, you could have at least given my money to the money lenders and gotten interest on it. So you could and should, give your money to the bank in the form of, certificates of deposit, or, you can put it out in the capital markets in the terms of bonds or instruments like that, where you're earning an interest rate of return because you don't need that money for 3 to 5 years. So that's the kind of the medium term bucket. Well, then
interrupt again. That medium term bucket, again, in our example here, would be that investments line, right?
Yes.
So in this budget that we are proposing, there is that short term savings account kind of line, the dishwasher breaks today, and there's also the investment kind of line. We know we're going to need a car in 3 to 5 years, and that is perhaps where that money is segregated. Okay, sorry.
And then finally, in the same kind of investments bucket, you can segregate out, things that are 5 years or longer. And there's where, you're not looking so much as, fixed rate type investments where you're just returning an interest, but you're looking for capital growth type investments where, if you've got a goal, the roof, we just put a new roof on. So, from the new roof, I know I got 20 years. So I can put that new roof money into a mutual fund because I got 20 years. And so short-term fluctuations in the stock market are not going to impact my roof money because I got 20 years on that. College savings money for your kids, if you're looking in that realm, or anything that's just retirement fills that, but there's also a longer term goal that's not necessarily retirement. The struggle with retirement is most retirement funds have 59.5 numbers on them. So you've got to be 59.5 to access those funds. So, depending on what your age is, if you're 20, you may have a goal that's going to come up in 20 years and you're 40, not 59.5. So, you've got to kind of distinguish where you put those dollars. But the point is, without getting into too many rules and details, but the point really is that, we need to think about where we're putting those dollars for, short-term, medium-term, and longer-term goals. But also, this begs just a completely separate question that we need to take a step back from is, we also need to have short, medium, and long-term goals, right? I think this is part of the reason why, people don't have much in savings is that there's not the true consideration of, hey, this stuff's going to wear out. We probably should accrue for it. As we said kind of in our introduction when we started this class, Michael's background's in accounting as a CPA, and CPAs love accruals, right? You accrue for everything. And so kind of talk a little bit about that concept as it relates here.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with your point is that there has to be, I think that's a Proverbs directive, know the condition of your herds, right? That knowing the condition of our assets and knowing that there is going to be a time when some of that has to be replaced, I think that proverb feeds into that we know the condition of our flocks. The accruing that you talk about is understanding that when a $10,000 planned and known replacement comes about, it's much easier both financially and I would say psychologically and for your mental health if there is $100 a month going into that bucket over a period of years to plan for that, in your term accrue for that it is something that is building over time as opposed to that we have our normal expenses, and then all of a sudden we have this enormous spike in expenses. And that spike is what catches the unwise steward off guard, because as long as our expenses are exactly normal and exactly what we expect, nobody has any problems really.
Right.
I mean, that we know in general, we know what the utilities and the cable bill and the mortgage are. And most who, if they're doing any level of budgeting, kind of have those things covered. But where the median income that we talk about, where problems arise is where there is not this accrual, this setting aside something little by little, so that those spikes are not tragedies. And again, as we'll talk about, that's a biblical principle, setting aside little by little, accumulating little by little, not in the accumulating of wealth in a bucket that we're trying to get rich scenario, but in a setting aside so that we can be prepared when those times come around. And there's a distinction there, and I think we'll get into that as we dig into some verses here momentarily.
Right, and that's kind of where I was thinking of that too. Is we've got a very famous biblical example of accrual, don't we?
Sure, a few of them. I got one in mind. You go ahead.
Well, I was thinking Joseph, right?
Oh, well, I was in 1 Corinthians 16. So I would think that that Paul essentially tells the Corinthians, he said, hey, set aside something each first day of the week as a congregation, little by little, and accrue that up, so that you're going to want to support me with funds when I show up. And if that is a surprise expenditure, then you're not going to be prepared. And I think his main point is you're going to be embarrassed that you can't help me if you're not prepared for this. And so even as a congregation, that was a spiritual directive given by Paul to set something aside, literally saving it up little by little. And so that when that time, that known event, Paul was coming at some point, when that known event does happen, that they are prepared for it.
And I love how it's one of the old translations, maybe it's the King James version or whatever, but oftentimes we hear that at the collection, right? So we're going to lay aside and store, and you hear that phrase, and it sounds goofy in our vernacular because we don't use those words. But think about them as, just break them apart, take them out of that context. He's saying we're going to take some money and we're going to put it in an account until you get there. Maybe in Corinth, that's a lockbox or a strong box or a money pouch.
A hole in the ground.
Or a hole in the ground, whatever it is. I'm not sure the banking systems of Corinth, right? I'm not really sure how that worked. I'm pretty sure they didn't give him a check. But, in some way it was, we're going to set this aside. You're going to take it out of your possession, out of your daily living, and you're going to set it over here so that it's prepared for when I get there, right? It's a pretty simple concept of, hey, and when you come together on the first day of the week, this is when you're going to do this process so that when I come, all things are ready. So, again, thinking about it from that standpoint is we don't know when Paul's coming, do we? I mean, at this point, when he's writing the letter, Paul's not really in control of his comings and goings at this point. So, it may be a month, it may be 6 months, it may be 2 years before Paul gets there. But when he gets there, the preparations are already going to be made. And so that's similar in this idea of savings. The other guy I was thinking about was, you think about Joseph. I mean, to me, that's almost the major example or the first thing that comes to mind in Genesis 34. Did we do a slide on Joseph, or we just talk about him?
No, you're jumping way ahead, but I'll let you do that.
I'm super ahead. All right. So I'm sorry. We'll circle back to Proverbs, but with Joseph, if you remember the story of Joseph, right? After Potiphar's wife, he's in prison. He meets the cupbearer and the baker.
Yes.
Two guys he meets in prison. So meets them, says, "Why the long face?" They say, "Well, we're in prison. It's sad here." He says, "Well, let's pick you up." He interprets their dreams. They forget about him. Pharaoh grabs him, and Pharaoh's having bad dreams. And so Joseph says, "Here's what your dream means. God has given me the interpretation of your dream. And your dream means that there's going to be 7 years of feast and 7 years of famine. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 1/5 of the produce of the land during the 7 plentiful years. And if we'll take that 1/5 and we'll store those in barns, when the lean years come, we're going to have plenty of grain. And not only, and remember how kind of the story ends, not only did they have plenty of grain for them, but they sold it to all the surrounding areas and doubled the size of Egypt over that. Because what they did here, and I think this is fascinating, it led to wealth, which is something that prudence typically does, as we're going to talk about from Proverbs here in just a second. It led to wealth, but really what it is, it's planning. It's just being thoughtful. If you knew at some point the drought was coming, then you save some back, and especially if you knew the drought was coming, imminently. And that's the point that we've been talking about with accrual. I know the dishwasher is going to break. I know my tires are going to wear out. So why not accrue 1/5 of the cost of the tires over the next 5 years, or 1/12 of the cost of the tires over the next 12 months, or whatever that number comes to be. But I think that's exactly what we're talking about here with this idea of knowing that there's something coming up and starting to set aside for it. Notice that, in here, they were taking 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt. They didn't take all of it. They didn't say, hey, we can't eat. Let's just lock everything down because it's going to get bad. It was, we're going to set aside a portion of this to fund long-term goals. We're going to take out of our short-term supply, we're going to fund a long-term goal. And that's
I would also note in that example that, remember that those 7 years where they were taking 20%, they were taking 1/5. In those 7 years, those were abundant years. And so that's kind of a biblical principle also I think we can apply here, is that when we do have surplus, right, we get an unexpected bonus, we get a government stimulus check. What are we doing with that surplus? Well, Joseph would give us the example of when you have surplus years, that is that is a perfect time. That is the opportune time, the wise time to, again, increase our giving. We do that first, and then increase our saving, so that when the lean years, which do happen, when they come, that we can be more prepared for those. And so just the concept of taking those unexpected income bumps, the birthday money or the unexpected funds, and saving those. If we did nothing more than just save those consistently, I think many would be much better off. Instead, you go to the local Walmart in Somerset and we're void of TVs as we speak. Why? Because stimulus money hits the bank, and it's a consumption based thought instead of this Joseph thought.
Right. And unfortunately, what we see is that and here's the downside of this, and we're going to spend a lesson later on debt, but what people do, because there isn't savings, is also the median credit card debt is $16,000. So the median $50,000 a year household has, what's that quick math? Is that, 25% of their annual income in credit card short-term debt?
Correct.
So
I would also note, if you got 7,000 in savings and 15,000 in credit card debt, you have 0 in savings. But go ahead.
Well, technically, you've got -9.
You got negative, so you got a deficit. Yeah,
you're running deficit spending, which at a federal government level apparently is fine, but on a local household level is terrible.
Oh no! Why do we think we do it as a government? It's because the government is made of people who are doing this in their household.
Well, and as a government, we've got a printing press out back, so the money just doesn't even matter. You just make it and throw it from the helicopter. But that's a whole nother fiscal responsibility conversation to have. The point here, though, as we look at this, is if we don't make plans, what we do is we end up in credit card debt, and credit card debt is the most expensive debt because it's short-term debt. It's meant to be revolved. You hear the term revolving line of credit. It's meant to, it's for the purpose of not using your cash. But when you carry those balances at a 16, 18, 24%, it's easy to see how some people get this snowball and they can never get out. We're going to talk about that later, but that's what people are doing here. Instead of that, let's listen to the Proverbs, right? Proverbs has, great points where he talks about Again, the wise man is saying, here are some principles you need to think about instead of getting wrapped up in dead and being beholden to others. Here's what you need to think about. So the first one from chapter 6:6-8, it talks about, go to the ant, you sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. She prepares her bread in the summer and gathers, right? So here, what comes every year? Winter. And in an agricultural-based society, you can't grow stuff in the wintertime. You can't. So what do you have to do? You have to prepare in the summer, prepare in the harvest for the wintertime. Make your bread, stack stuff up, because that's going to happen. This is the same principle that Michael and I have been talking about with savings. We know that these expenditures are coming. It's foolish for us not to look there.
A couple other thoughts in the Proverbs, Mike, and then make another point here at the end. But Proverbs 21:5, the plans of the diligent lead to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. Hasty would be, kind of profligate spending, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of being thoughtful, being diligent about setting something aside. Proverbs 21:20, precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it. A foolish man consumes everything that is income without saving any treasure and oil in his own dwelling for the time when he needs it. The foolish man devours all of it. Again, we talked about last time, if you're stripping your vineyard bare, not only is there nothing for the sojourner that is our command, but also we can't set anything aside. In the parable of the excellent wife in Proverbs 31, she considers a field and buys it. That's investment. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She is prepared. She has, scarlet is almost an investment product in that day. It is a thoughtful, in times of abundance, setting something aside so that in times of need, the household has what they have. So anyway, I just think that is an interesting example of the excellent wife. And for those of us like Mike and I who are in team Married Up, we understand that an excellent wife has those attributes, thinking ahead, planning for her family. That's exactly the concept that we're talking about. The last proverb here, and I'm actually going to go back to look at something that we talked about in the budget, and that is that there was a line item here for life insurance, and you might think, well, what does that possibly have to do with saving? That's an insurance product. Well, I think, Mike, to your point, we're looking at different time horizons here. The savings account is short-term needs. The investment account is medium-term needs. The retirement account is long-term planning. Life insurance goes it's beyond life planning. And is there a spiritual principle for that? Well, I would note Proverbs 13:22, a good man leaves inheritance to his children's children. And so in my judgment, part of being prudent with our resources is thinking about not that we're trying to make our children rich, but if something happens to us, what are they going to do? That seems to me to be a wise and thoughtful use of resources, and just another bucket of saving, not for our own benefit, but for somebody else's.
And life insurance is one of those things, everyone that is, I would say outside of retirement age, I would almost unequivocally, if you're still in the accumulation phase of life, before you get to that distribution phase, you should have life insurance. And the reason is that, what we do is those medium-term and those long-term goals are all well and fine as long as we're here, right? When we talk about accrual, it's if I put away $20 a month, then in 5 years, I'm going to have money for my goal. But the problem is if I get hit by a truck in year 3, I don't have the money for that goal, right? That goal never gets funded. So, we ought to plan that is as if I don't get here, especially where you've got a primary breadwinner in the household. If you've got somebody that, your household income is $50,000 for the year, but that's comprised of one that's making 40 and one that's making 10, we got to protect the 40, right? If that 40 goes away, now the 10 can't make up the rest of the budget. Okay. So it's important that income stream is protected. And with life insurance products, it works on the idea of leverage. You're paying very small dollars to get big dollars in case something happens to you. So if you had a life insurance policy that paid, $500,000 out as a death benefit, but it was, $20 a month. So 20 times 12 months, and let's say it was a 20-year policy times 20 years, you're going to pay $4,800 over the life of that policy. But if you die over the next 20 years, your family gets $500,000. It's a great trade every time. It makes all the sense in the world financially because you're committing $4,800 to protect $500,000. And that's the way really to do the math is what's my premium expense? What's it going to cost me over the term versus what I'm going to get? And this is not a class where we're going to get into the difference between term life and whole life and universal life and all that jazz. That's not what's important. What's important is it's leverage. And it's leverage that you're paying a small amount to protect a larger amount. And if you have children at home, if you have debt, if you have, income that needs to be replaced because you have medium and long-term goals, this is my pitch 100%. You got to have some life insurance to protect that.
In that way, Mike, it's literally the opposite of having credit card debt. Credit card debt is some short-term payment or some short-term benefit for a much bigger long-term payment. Life insurance is kind of the short-term payment for some potential long-term benefit. And I think Proverbs gives us that directive that we need to be thinking about an inheritance is not, it can be looked down on at times, but inheritance is not a negative thing if it's done correctly, and if it's handled rightly, especially, God forbid, if something happens to us, while we're still in those income years when our children are dependent on us. We need to be thinking about that. I think that's definitely a proverbial directive. So,
one quick thing before we leave there, our children can inherit good from us, but our children can also inherit bad, as we know, and whether it's personality characteristics, traits, lack of work ethic, whatever. But one of the things, especially for a family, is you can inherit debt. If you've got, let's say, in this scenario, you got a husband that's working and a wife that's staying home taking care of the kids. Well, if that husband dies and that income stream goes away, well, the wife and the kids just inherited a mortgage that they can't pay and bills that they can't pay. And if there's not some type of protection built in there, if that's not thought of, then what you've been left for an inheritance is dead and maybe a potential bankruptcy, which is a problem.
Again, there's a balance between prudent saving and trying to accumulate wealth. I think that's an important distinction to make, especially in regards to leaving an inheritance to your children and to your children's children. So something we keep in mind. I don't think there's a number there. I think it's one of those many possession principles where we're intended to struggle with it and pray about it and make that distinction. But it is certainly a biblical principle.
And let's slide just quickly back to 21:5. I love the way that it puts it. The plans of the diligent surely lead to abundance, not necessarily rich or wealth, just abundance. More than what is an abundance? It's more than what you need, and that's really what we're getting at here in savings. Is if you plan, if you just think about this stuff, you can accrue for and have excess. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to be, have Bill Gates money if you do a budget. But I believe if you do a budget, you'll stay out of $16,000 worth of credit card debt. If you plan, you can accrue for these things and maybe even accrue for things that don't happen, right? We talked about if you've got 60,000 mile tires and you are accruing to replace them at 60,000 and you keep accruing, but they last till 75 or 80. You know what that is? That's abundance because you kept saving that money aside for that one goal, and turns out you didn't need it as quickly as you thought you did. So there's times like that this planning, this saving leads to abundance. Not necessarily, I'm not saying we're going to get uber wealthy, but it gives us cushion, maybe is a better term for that.
In the time we have left, Mike, a few kind of questions, practical. Again, as we're at this intersection of practicality and spirituality, some practical questions I think for Christians and saving. So I would ask these to you because it's more fun when you get put on the spot than when I do. Is saving an indication of lack of faith? Are we relying too much on ourselves when we say, I'm going to put this aside? Is it not more godly rather to say that God will take care of us all, and I'm not going to put this in my hands, I'm going to put it in God's hands?
Well, I think that's just terrible fallacy, because what we would probably learn if the curtains were rolled back is God saying, I am providing by what I've given you, and I've got some for the rainy day too, right? I didn't just give you scraps to where you can barely make it. If you would have properly handled the funds, you had plenty for today and for tomorrow. To me, it's more of a lack of faith when we don't, consider our flocks, when we don't, put these things to test and say, hey, what are my assets? What are my liabilities? Where do I stand? And how can I count the cost and protect for when, not if, when the rainy day comes, when the emergency comes, right? And think about this principle. We talk about this in other aspects of our spiritual lives, but, what if everybody lived like that? Who's going to be there in the kingdom to help you out if everybody's spending every dollar that's in and saying the Lord will provide? Well, that just doesn't even make any sense, right? If we've stripped our fields bare, or there's a phrase, I can't remember, I was kind of flipping around my desk here a minute ago looking for this quote, but it's something to the effect of, we even ate the seed corn. So when you plant corn, you have to keep so much of it back because you've got to plant that. That's your seed for the next year. But when times have gotten lean and where farmers have gone bust and corn apparently, is that if you eat your seed corn and you have nothing to plant, you have no future harvest either. So we've got to be careful that we've always got a little seed corn, laying around as faith that the harvest is going to come again.
Yeah, two thoughts on that. One is, how do we think that God does provide? If we're just standing out in the field with a bucket, we're most likely that bucket's not going to get filled with the resources that we need. God provides through the times that are abundant. And to your point, that I think that makes perfect sense. Secondly, I would say it is spending 100% of our income that, in my judgment, is an indication of lack of faith, because it completely disregards the source and the ownership of what we have. So I would agree with you and turn that question on its head a little bit. Secondly, what's the difference between, this is a good question for an investment advisor, what's the difference between laying up treasures on earth, and remember talking about a statement of Jesus we're all familiar with, don't lay up treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt. What's the difference between laying up treasures on earth versus prudent, responsible, godly saving?
So context is everything. And this is one of those that I've heard people do almost to say that, poverty is next to godliness, that if you, are in abject poverty, somehow you're holier than others because you haven't laid up for yourselves any treasures on earth. What Jesus is talking about is where our confidence is. So prudent savings and being a good steward of what God has given us is a biblical principle, right? When we talk about, Jesus says to count the cost. Well, there's an assumption there that there's something to count. Right? How do you build a tower? You've got to count the cost. There's an assumption that there's something there to count, that you've got resources that you're going to depend on to be able to do something. But when we lay up for ourselves treasures on earth, what happens is that sometimes our faith, our safety net, our confidence is in our bank account and not in our God to provide. And I've seen that is, as long as the government is in control, or as long as I'm a U.S. citizen, like I feel everything's going to be all right, and I'm not really relying or depending on God for what I need. That's just as much laying up for myself treasures here on earth. That's where my confidence is, as opposed to saying, you know what, I'm going to plan for tomorrow, but if tomorrow doesn't come, I'm okay with that because I'm going home. You know, I'm okay with the fact that, you know, if the United States falls, if we end up under a different world power regime, I'm still okay with that because I'm just a traveler here anyway. I'm just trying to get home. So my treasure, my possessions, what's important to me is at the house in heaven. It's not what's in my bank account. It's not, you know, my house here on earth. It's not these possessions that give me confidence and give me comfort. It's the God that I serve that gives me confidence and gives me comfort. So I think that's more of the context.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think as we think about, you know, 1 Timothy chapter 6, what Paul tells Timothy there is exactly in line with what you're saying. So those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and the snare into senseless and harmful desires. Well, that temptation is a dependence on the reliance moves from God to something else, and that's why that riches are very often a snare. So, is there a saving that is not laying up treasures on earth? For sure, and I think there's biblical principle for that. Mike, investing is risky. I've read that in every investment prospectus that I've ever gotten. Investing is risky. Is this gambling with God's money? And is there a point where investment can become gambling? And what's the distinction?
So, you know, for sure, investing is risky, but let's define investing, right? You know, oftentimes when I hear this quote or when I have these conversations, it's in the terms of, well, investing in the stock market is risky. So if I buy a stock today that's $20, tomorrow it could be $10, and therefore the stock market is risky. Okay, investing in anything's risky though, right? You know, if you plant a field and you buy seed and you sow that seed, you have an investment of your time, your effort, your energy, plus your seed. And there's no guarantee that those crops are coming to market. There's no guarantee that there's a buyer on the other side of that.
I mean, yeah, think about the Proverbs 31 woman was praised for buying that field. There was risk associated with that. Sorry, continue.
There's tons of risk associated. And you know, ask your local cattle farmer right now. I mean, beef prices are down 50 cents a pound. You know, there are cattle farmers right now that are struggling, that have investment in that cattle, that have, you know, whether, you know, both in the raising and the time, the effort, and the energy, but also if they've purchased calves and are feeding calves along the way. So any investment, you know, investment in that is risky. And I would say even investments in yourself. I mean, think about, you know, I think about college kids right now that are coming out. You're coming out into an awful economy. You may have just spent $50, $80, $100,000 on education, and guess what? There's no guarantee you got a job right now. So that's also, you know, a risky type investment. Now, is that gambling? No, you're making a prudent decision based on allocating some resources, and you believe over time there will be a return on those assets. That's typically what we do in the stock market. Again, I'm going to say typically. Typically what we do is we look at, you know, a company and they're, you know, they make $2 a share, and they're, you know, on an earnings basis, and a prudent multiple for that is, you know, a 10 multiple. So that stock should trade at $20 a share. So if I can buy that company at $16 a share, I think that there's some upside there, and you can make money. Now, that's what prudent investing is finding value, of looking at companies that are going to grow those earnings over time and therefore participate in the profits of those companies. However, you can also do what's called day trading, and you can get in and you're looking for very short-term, quick moves that have nothing to do with earnings, that have nothing to do with corporate profits, that have nothing to do with participating in the growth of a company, but you are quickly moving in and out of stocks with no, you know, desire to really grow and participate in profits. I'm convinced that if you're doing that especially on some of these high frequency basis, that it's just gambling. It's chance. The definition of gambling is when you're looking at chance, not looking at, you know, value over time, but looking at absolute, you know, chance. And so you can have an investment strategy that is purely high risk chance, especially if you're investing in, you know, what's called penny stocks, you know, these companies that are worthless, that, you know, will move for a while on their way to bankruptcy. You know, there's investment strategies that 100% I would tell you is no different than going to a riverboat in Mississippi.
So yeah, can investing be gambling? Yes. There is a super wonky intersection that we should do sometime about is value investing more godly than momentum investing. I just think that the crowd for that would be like super small, but it'd be super
Like
wonky.
us, I think.
Yeah, it'd be super wonky, but I would dig it. So yes, there is a point where, and again, I don't think that's defined. I think we got to be like so many things. We got to be prayerful and meditate about this. In my investment in that part of my saving, am I doing that in a godly way? Am I doing that in a prudent way with God's resources? Would again, if these things are God's, are we comfortable telling God that, hey, I put it all on this 3-penny stock because I was looking for a short-term blip today and was going to try to sell it this afternoon? That again, that doesn't feel like something that we should be comfortable with God's money. I had a couple more of these. Is retirement a godly ideal? I think this leads to an interesting discussion. So I'm going to offer a couple of Bible verses here and get you to respond. Mm-hmm. So I would say that in the world at large, retirement is a worshipped ideal in some ways. Cannot wait to get to retirement. Cannot wait till I can do what I want to do and put aside daily obligations, and I've saved up so that I can live with my desires and do what I want to do. It's kind of the world's view of that. I can play golf every day. Couple of thoughts in that regard. I'll always go back when this conversation to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15, that that God's vision for us of man's ideal, like Eden, perfection, that man had a job. That man was in the garden to keep it and to work it, and that was in Eden. That was before the fall. That was the ideal. Was that man had I'm sorry?
Utopia.
That was utopia. That was the ideal. That man had a responsibility. Man had a job. That I don't think it's a stretch to say from that man is intended that man's highest and best use of intellectually and spiritually, that there's intended to be work involved in man's life. Secondly, I would say there, even in the Old Testament, look at Numbers chapter 8, in other places, that if you look at the Levites in Numbers chapter 8, they were directed to work in the tabernacle for, I think it's 20 to 25 years. And then their work in the tabernacle was completed, and they moved on to minister brethren into other roles. But that role for them as a worker in the tabernacle was completed. So anyway, I would put those verses to you. Say, so how do we take all that and come up with a Christian, a godly view of retirement?
So, and I think that it's always important to define terms. So when we're talking about retirement, what we're talking about is replacing an income stream that I get currently on a W-2. So I go to work and I clock in and I clock out and I get a paycheck for that. So can I save up enough percentage of that paycheck over my 30, 40-year working career to where now I've got an income stream where I don't have to go and punch the time clock, but I still have enough money coming in to pay my bills? That's really what we're talking about, is this shift from, do I have to go to work for 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and can I get the same or at least enough money that I need because I've now paid off a bunch of stuff and my bills are at a certain level. So that's what we're talking about. So in those terms, retirement, I think is absolutely a godly ideal, but what are you retiring from and what are you retiring to? I think when we replace that income stream, if I'm doing that to lay on the couch or to sit in the rocking chair and not be involved, no. I mean, I think that's a bad steward of what God has blessed us with. But if I don't have 40 hours that I'm beholden to XYZ Corporation, and now I've got 40 hours freed up for kingdom purposes, Absolutely. We should be working to that as soon as possible. That now I can take that time, that effort, that energy, that intellect, those, by the way, skills, assets, and abilities that God has blessed me with for the purposes of the kingdom that I've used to enrich XYZ Corporation. Now that I can use them full time, 100% for the kingdom, 100. Yeah, absolutely. That should be what our goal is that we retire to be of more service to others, more service in the kingdom. We retire to be able to do things. I've jokingly said for, the last 20 years that I've been a financial planner is that, I'm a financial planner to support my preaching habit. That's why I do what I do. I love and enjoy helping people and helping families 100%, but it supports my ability to preach and to teach and to spend time with others. So if I can save over time and free up to where now I can preach with, as Paul said, without being a burden to congregations, I can come and share and teach. That's what my personal goal is. Now, to the effect of where everyone has their own skills, talents, and abilities, I think that's got to be part of the retirement plan. That, I'm retiring to be able to do this. I'm not going to go 40 hours a week to XYZ Corporation, but I'm going to do this for the kingdom. I'm going to use this skill set to be effective in the kingdom.
I don't know who this XYZ Corporation is, but it sounds like a terrible place. I don't know why anybody would want to work there. But yeah, completely agree with all those points. I would direct anyone to Numbers chapter 8. I just think that's so instructive, at least to me, and that these Levites had a job. Their work was in the tabernacle, and there was a time when that work was completed. There's a time when our earthly job, there's probably a time when it needs to come to an end. But when that ended, it was very clear, God was very clear to them that they had a role in the nation of Israel after that point, even after their work life, so to speak, was completed. Their job was to minister to the brethren and guard the tabernacle and to do things for God's purposes, even after their work life was completed. So I think that helps me understand what my retirement ideal is. Last question, Mike. How much is too much? And I think that this is one that we're not going to give a prescription for. I'm not sure there is one, right. But there is a point when saving becomes accumulating, and that's a dangerous place. And I think that at least we need to be aware of that and cognizant of that. Is if we are becoming a bucket, if we're becoming an accumulator of wealth, instead of what we talked about last time, a funnel, a distributor of wealth, that becomes a problem. It makes perfect sense to save for replacement of things and for the retirement that we talked about. But at some point, those things get funded. And when those things are funded and we're comfortable with where they are and they can cover our needs, is there a point where that becomes accumulation? I believe the answer is yes. Yeah. And we do become a bucket. And I think that is a danger as God continues to bless us. That is a danger we have to be on the lookout for.
And I think that, that's the hard question, right? That's the hard look in your mirror question of, this savings account can become our God. I mean, we can be so dedicated and responsible to, meeting these savings goals that's what becomes important. And, the question becomes as because you can always take one goal and replace it with another, right? Once I've saved dishwasher money, now I need tire money, and now I need whatever. You can assign a new goal to everything, and force into that. But to me, the litmus test has always been, how willing am I to put my saving on hold to help somebody else? How willing am I to, in this budget, to go in and make adjustments because there is a need? I'm always in awe of that story in Acts where everyone went and sold their property. And I think about, what if that happened today? Maybe we don't go sell our property, but would we all go cash out our 401k? Would we all take whatever liquid assets we have and bring them to, the elders, or, if we had apostles, how willing would we be to do that? And again, the important part to remember from that story is it was always an individual choice. That was the rub with Ananias and Sapphira, right? Just be honest with what you're selling. it was perfectly fine for them to keep back a portion of the money if they'd have just said, hey, we're going to give you 80% of the proceeds of this house. We're going to keep 20 in the bank, for savings purposes or whatever. They got no qualms from the apostles about that. The rub is that they lied. So, but I think about that, how willing are we to divorce ourselves from our individual financial goals if it meant helping others, especially in a meaningful way, like, the situation that happened there in Acts. And I think that's a question we ought to ask ourselves. And, really with truth serum, how would I answer that question? And that's going to tell me whether, I'm truly a bucket or a funnel.
Yep. And that obviously that has impact on what, if you ask the question, well, what percentage of my income should I be saving? Well, that's a fluid question. That question has to do with, is this a year of abundance in terms of Joseph? Is this a year of abundance? What is the condition of our flocks? What's the condition of our replacement fund currently? Have we been saving for the past 10 years and we have a replacement fund in good place? We have a retirement fund in good place? Or are we just starting with that? The answers to those questions could change what is prudent saving dramatically, which is why it's hard to have a prescription for that. If we have a replacement fund, if we have life insurance, if we have retirement funds, then maybe the amount that needs to go to those each month is much smaller. If we haven't set anything aside, we need to be taking a more sizable percentage and putting it toward those areas. So it's hard to have a prescription for that. The other test the heart question there would be, if we have had those years of abundance, if we have been blessed and those replacement and retirement funds are funded to a point where we're comfortable, then what happens to that abundance? Is it going into the giving bucket? Is that flowing over into the giving bucket that we talked about last lesson? Or is it flowing into the consumption bucket? That's a test the heart question also.
And we're going to get to this kind of down the road when we get to the house too. There's also, if you've got a family of 4 living in a 2-bedroom house, it's okay to say, hey, maybe we need to expand here, and some of that money needs to roll to that. But we're going to talk about too, are we accumulating assets to accumulate assets, or are we accumulating capital assets to be useful in the kingdom? And that's got to be part of this conversation as well, of, not just building bigger barns for the sake of building bigger barns, but are we building bigger barns to use those barns in the kingdom? That's part of this as well, that we think about where we're shifting the abundance to and what we're comfortable at. But the other thing here is, I keep coming back to, when we think about, where are we truly laying these treasures up? But, is the savings account becoming my God, that as long as I have this, I'm okay? That's something that we got to constantly kind of beat on ourselves with. If you put, fill me up full of true serum, and said, Mike, I need a hard number. The number I would give you, if you're just starting out, if you don't have these accounts in place, is probably 8% or 1/12 of your income to start. If you have zero savings and, a bunch of credit card debt, I would take that 1/12 and throw it at the credit card debt to get your savings account at least to zero. Because as we talked about before, if you've got credit card debt and no savings, then you're running a negative savings, right? We understand that. So that's got to be wiped out to get that number to zero. And then you should have 6 months worth of expenses, household expenses, on hand in that liquid savings account at all times. That's what helps in pandemics. That's what helps if you get laid off. It gives you time to find another job. So I would start there with roughly 8%. But here's the thing, and we'll kind of close here because I know we're running out of time, and I don't want to get away from this, but so we talked about close to 15% in our giving fund, right? Out of our income. If you're not saving, then that number needs to be about 8%. So we're at 23. In this family, in this household, your effective tax rate. So we're going to have a whole class on taxes, but effective tax rate is, for the income that you have today, what percentage of that income goes to Uncle Sam. All right. So that effective tax rate is another 5%. So we're 15.8, we're 23 plus 5, we're at 28% of your income in the first, 2 lessons of budgeting. So, when you think about that now with the remaining 72% of your income, that's where you've got to make, what kind of house can I afford to buy? What kind of, car can I afford to drive? What kind of neighborhood can I afford to live in? You've got to start making those decisions on those net dollars. But if you go to your local banker, and I work for a bank and I love banks, but the mortgage loan officer that sits next to me is a great guy and I love him to death, but he's going to tell you, no, take your gross number and you can live on 36% of that as your mortgage payment. So as long as your total payments and all that are 36% of that gross number, you're perfectly fine. And by the way, those payments don't include food or utilities or anything else. That's why it's 36%. So they will tell you numbers that are not based on these biblical principles that Michael and I are talking about. We need to, pay God first, kingdom goals first, set aside some emergency money second, because, if you buy the house and use all your money for the house, if something breaks in the house, you can't afford to replace it. You got to see Uncle Sam. So now we're getting to the net dollars that you can use to allocate for those resources.
Yes. And, I think in our example, I was just doing the math in our example, the mortgage itself was about 18%. So just to give you an example, use that as an example. And to your point, debt to income, as defined by the world, doesn't fit in our stewardship budget. But if you take out giving, if you take out saving, and then start there, then those numbers get a little more realistic. And that's kind of a practical example or practical way of how to do that. I'm going to do this in 30 seconds or less, Mike, because I know we've stretched on here. Practical tips. We've talked about these. Separate into separate, and I put emergency because I had not had this lesson yet and I hadn't learned from you that I'm going to call that a replacement fund. So separate replacement funds, I think, make a ton of sense. A car replacement fund set aside, we know that's covered, and then maybe move on to the roof, and then maybe move on to whatever's the tires or whatever's next. Nothing wrong with separate funds, or at least mentally we're thinking about that. And then secondly, I would say it's easier if it's automatic. That's the way that government makes sure we pay our taxes. Is that it's automatic. It comes out of the check and we don't get a say in it. And so if we set up our lives in such a way that with every paycheck, some is going to savings, and I would also add some is going to our Kingdom Purposes giving account. If those things are happening automatically without us having to think about it, it just makes this process easier. So set that up where it happens automatically. And I believe that we'll find that we end up saving in a more consistent way.
Yeah, and it's so much easier now, right? I feel bad for, the 20-year-old you and me, right? Where you were balancing checkbooks, you had to go in the bank and physically move money over from the checking to savings and all that jazz. Whereas now, you set all the stuff on autopilot. Look, when I get paid, I want $25 to go to this account, $25 to go to that account. You don't even have to do anything. It just automatically, as soon as your check comes in, move it around. There are plenty of financial institutions that offer free accounts. You can have 10 checking accounts. Nobody cares. It's, but have those assigned to goals. I love that idea of doing that and doing it automatically. But I'll throw one more in there. Don't rob Peter to pay Paul. Don't rob the dishwasher account to go to the movies. Don't rob the, tire account because you saw a shirt that you wanted. We've also got to have some discipline built in here that once that money goes into that account, the only way it comes out is for the purposes that we set that account up.
And that is kind of the point of budgeting, right? Is that we have that plan and we got the discipline to stick to it. And so the first two priorities, as we think about what happens to our funds, we're going to give it and we're going to save it. And then in our next class, we'll talk about what we can do after that. But I believe if those two priorities are in that order and in line, we're in good shape.
Yeah, I think those are the godly principles is, give and save, or give and protect. If we can get those down, the spending side of it, we'll have a whole lot easier time on. But if you can't get those two down, then we're going to have a hard time reining in the spending.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it as always, my friend. Have a good day.
Thank y'all for dialing in. Again, like, share, comment. If you go back to our post from last week, Michael posted that budget worksheet that we're working off of. If you can't find that post or need it, email, text, call one of us, and we'd be happy to share that with you. Thanks for tuning in and spending your day with us.
Or comment on other topics that you'd like for us to tackle. We'd be happy to do that. So let us know, and God bless.
Thanks.